How's everyone doing? So today I'm going to be making a video for a new series that I'm coming up with. I'm going to call it Meta Recap for now. I don't know if I'll change the name later. So basically every 4 weeks or every major update, I'll be doing one of these and I'll do it on the third week of each major update. I didn't want to do it on the final week because I didn't want it to clash with potential new heroes that are coming up. I might want to make video for those as well. So since this is the first recap, it's going to be a little bit lengthier just so I can lay down the groundwork for future recaps. So let's see what we're going to cover first. So first off, we're going to be covering the new units, and this basically covers my opinion when I'm playing them or when I'm playing against them from other players, and if neither me or other players are playing them, why are they unplayable? So other than that, I'll also be covering the overall meta during this major update, which is basically what type of boxes I've played against and what box me myself am playing as well. So last one, I didn't really know how to name it. It just sounds more dramatic than it actually is. It's basically some of the standout performers, so like things that are worthy to be first or second pick, and as well as those that used to be first, second pick worthy, but they're not the same anymore. So first off, we're gonna start with IBC. So she was hyped as a tier 1 DPS, which is just below like Release Sprint and Lucretia. Those are like tier 0. She was hyped up as a tier 1 unit. So however, this was not really reflected in the draft priority from my experience. She's mostly a third or fourth pick. So her hype was basically because she both carries a very strong damage and as well as very strong support, especially for 3 mobility units. So her 3C has the potential to take 1 life off tanks instantly. It's a 1.8 times attack that cripples their soldier healing as well as dispels 5 buffs. And her so-called strong mobility support from her power formation is basically 3 turns of +2 mobility or +1 for 4 mobility units. And this thing basically has 100% uptime at 6 stars, assuming you don't use act against or anything of that sort. So just from this description, we can kind of draw a parallel to Akaya. So Akaya is basically a great support that carries somewhat good damage as well. So compared to IBC, she has 2 turns of +2 mobility, which is shorter, but it applies to everyone in the team including herself, and also includes like 5 mobility units, so cavalries and flyers. So she's not limited to buffing assassins and infantries. So other than that, she also has the option to carry her act against skill. She has to compromise her 3C if she wants to do that, or she can compromise her mobility buff depending on the draft. So she turns into a full support that way. But in scenarios where she brings her 3C, it's actually still a very strong hit. It just doesn't one-hit tanks like IBC does, but it's still strong enough to kill most DPS that exists right now. So following that train of thought, if her role in the box is a support, then naturally she will be sidelined for the more important DPSs like Wedam, Werner, Diehard, and Lucretia, because at the end of the day, those are the units that actually get things done. So she's just the enabler. So other than that, she also finds it difficult to find a box balance, because if you put too many 3 mobility units in the box, you will find it hard to draft when she eats an early ban. But if you have too little of those units that benefit from her buff, her utility kind of just diminishes, because you don't need her to buff most of the early picks, hence the low pick priority that we are seeing right now. So she also has synergy issues. There is a mismatch between what she provides as a DPS and the people that benefits from her buffs. So the biggest beneficiaries of her mobility buff are assassins and AoE nukers. So both of these types of units kind of bypass the tank entirely. Assassins just snipe their units behind the tank, and AoEs just kind of ignore the tank altogether. Hence, her strong attack on the tank that can potentially one-life the tank is kind of wasted. It doesn't synergize with these units as well. So on the flip side, if you're not playing against a tank, you are probably better off picking naturally high range units such as Diehard, Elwyn, Wedem, instead of picking IBC plus any one of these units. And in such aggressive matchups, it is hard to maintain her power formation because you end up trading units very early on, and by the time she gets to she wants to recast her power formation, she might not have enough units left, and even if you do have enough units left, you might not find it possible for them to group up in that specific formation for her to use that power formation. So if she can't get her power formation back up, her role as a DPS is kind of weakened severely because she loses the bonus Dispel 5 from her 3C, and she also is stuck at 3 mobility because most people are enchanting their IBCs with Clock Enchant instead of Breeze because they don't stack with power formation. So having said that, she's still really solid in tank bus comms or even otherwise. She's just not as broken as we once thought. So after having gone through most of power formation, I kind of want to cover what I consider an underutilized part of her kit, which is her endurance formation. So on top of the main function of this endurance formation, which is displacement immunity, her soldier defense buffs can help avoiding one-hit KOs, since these KOs generally happen in scenarios where the soldiers tank 2 hits each, which leaves 20 hits for the hero body to tank after that, because from a full health unit there are 40 hits total, 2 from each troop and then 20 from the hero. So if the soldiers tank 2 hits each, there will be 20 hits left that the hero has to tank after that, which will usually result in a KO. So with the 50% defense and MDef buff from her endurance formation, there is a possibility of making each soldier tank an extra hit, so 3 hits. And in that case, there will only be 10 hits left for the hero body to tank, which is much more manageable. So this example is kind of general, but it's definitely worth looking into. So other than that, her endurance formation actually gives very strong buffs to her attack, relative to her power formation. So in her endurance formation, her 2C gets buffed to have a reduced cooldown and an AoE heal, and her 3C gets buffed so that she gains a move again after she attacks, and she applies a damage reduction in 1 ring of herself after that, and also soldier healing after battle, which is kind of like TRS but only for the soldiers. So these are all significant things that added together can give you just that slight edge that you need to survive an extra turn that you wouldn't otherwise, which will allow you to come out on top in the war of attrition. So finally, it is simply easier to just cast Endure formation in defensive teams because you don't trade away your units as much and you tend to stick together anyways. So for the above reasons, I think Endure formation is underutilized and underexplored, and even her preview stage ignores that part of a kit. They only, force you to use power formation to clear that. So this section was kind of lengthy, but I think it's justified given how hyped up she was during her release. So next, moving on, we have Archon of the Moon. Initially, I gave him a backup box rating, and that is still mostly true. So just by having him in the box, it forces you to ban Hilda and IBC to a degree. And if those things were already units that you wanted to ban, then it's all good. But otherwise, things get kind of awkward, which is what happened to me. And I find him to shine more against offensive teams partially because they usually have less ways of dealing with displacement in general. And he carries a budget revive, a 10% revive, which is not actually that great because he can get killed by things like passive block, post-battle fixed damage such as sneak attack from Diehard and Werner, or 2 2-stage attacks such as Ares and Helena's attacks. So, however, this revive is very good in water because you get 60% HP back after you revive. So in that case, you only die to passive block. So hence why I call him a backup box unit, because you can see the map before you enter your next map. So if you see a water map, you can just slot him in and he becomes significantly stronger than otherwise. So the best part of his kit in this matchup is actually his ability to have a 6-tile act again after his initial hook, which, you know, because it's a full act again, it's not something like Chivalry where they limit you to 3 blocks or 2 blocks. It is a proper act again, so he gets full mobility. So this long mobility allows him to, you know, reach very deep into the enemy lines, and you can basically get whatever kill you want most of the time. And well, as long as you can identify the most important kill on the map. So he's decent as a ban bait against tank push boxes after you ban their Hilda, because I guess from their perspective, it sounds like a lose-lose situation, right? Because either their tank will get pulled up and then their backline gets sniped, or you just simply drag out the unit that's in front and you slaughter them. But whether he's worth such an early ban in those situations is another question altogether that you will have to answer for yourself. So moving on into the overall ladder meta that I've encountered during these few weeks, it's actually very diverse, and all of these boxes are strong in their own way. But having said that, I think the part in the middle where, you know, I label it kind of I think 2 tanks, 3 healers sort of boxes. So, you know, on one end we have like 3 tanks, 4 healers, and in some extreme cases I've even seen 4 tanks, 5 healers. And then compared to the box that I'm running, which is 1 tank, 2 healers. So, you know, anything in between this, I find it kind of meh, because you will get out-traded by more aggressive boxes, and you will also get outstalked by more bulkier boxes. Other than that, DPS options are very fluid nowadays, so there are more than enough viable DPSs to go around, regardless whether you want to play more AoE or more single target. There's just too many units right now. As for my personal box, so during this time period, I've made minor changes twice. So from this initial box, I've swapped out Kruger back into Hilda, and then I've swapped out Archon for Autocrato. So for the first change from Kruger to Hilda, so initially I slotted Kruger in because, you know, I like having his utility as a disabler. You know, he dispels buffs, does decent damage, does debuffs as well, and he combos well with IBC. But I found the draft very hard to execute because I have to ban both Hilda and Rosen. So because at this point I still have Archon in my box, so I have to ban Hilda, that's a given, and then I have to ban Rosen for Kruger. So in that case, I pretty much let out every DPS under the sun, Wedham, Lucretia, Elwyn, Diehard, everything. And you just get out-tempoed in the 5v5 DPS game, because IBC Kruger, you know, they are strong supports, but fundamentally they don't make the kills happen. So you kind of leave it up to the rest of the 3 units. And because I don't have Hilda or Hilda in the box, so my DPS gets banned more easily. So it's harder for me to draft that way. So Hilda offers more stability in the draft, and she's decent ban bait. And having a tank is kind of nice because that means I can be less worried about things like Elwyn, Helena, you know, striker units that primarily hit the tank that don't bypass tanks. So I can leave them later on in the draft rather than banning them early. So her utility just by being a tank is kind of nice in that way. So next on we have converting Archon to Autocrato. So I've already mentioned this earlier during Archon section, but Archon skews my draft in a way that I wasn't really comfortable with, because in the current meta with the box that I'm playing, I don't actually want to ban Hilda or Rosen. So forcing the Hilda ban makes my draft really weird. And then I forgot to ban IBC one time too many times and I just yeeted him out of the box. and then I swapped Autocrator back in. So Autocrator was a unit that I initially thought would fall off because of IBC's existence, and by extension possibly introducing Kyra back into the main meta, but turns out he's actually still really strong. So he offers more stability, similar to Hilda, having the potential to off-tank as well. And he's effectively a more defensive version of Kruger as a disabler. So, Employees of the Month. It's a bit of a funny name, but, let's get right into it. So the first unit we have here is Lucretia. She's still the premier DPS. I still first ban her most of the time, even though I don't have burn in my box anymore. Because her puppet mobility allows her to either go for an extremely long range 1-for-1 trade, or the possibility of a 1-for-0 trade if she can hit with her main hero and then swap back from her puppet. So this is compounded if there are any sort of mobility buffs, so a natural breeze, or if you have something like IBC, you can boost both Lucretia and her puppet, and she just basically can reach across the entire map. So next up, her minus cooldown will always find a use, regardless if you're minusing the cooldown of mass attack to buff your units, you are reducing the cooldown of your tank's guard skill, so it basically has 0 downtime, or you're just reducing the cooldown of an attack that you have used on another unit or on Lucretia. And I think minus cooldown is borderline OP because it only has 1 cooldown and it reduces 1 cooldown from every single skill on that unit. So one of her kind of weakness is that she's kind of dead weight on turn 1 because her puppet can't use her skills, and her range is, she's just a 3+5 mage, and she still needs to buff herself with mass attack most of the time. But she will still janitor your team if you don't counter her properly, if you don't kill her. So next up we have Wedam, which is what I like to call the lesser evil compared to Lucretia. So he has an incredibly potent snowballing talent, things like one kill leading to another, like Assassin comes in, snipes one of your unit at the start of turn 2, suddenly you have Despair on 3 of your units, he comes in, kills another unit, and before you know it, you lose the means of counter killing their units and you just lose to the number game. So he's highly flexible, he can use Annihilation to one-shot tanks in conjunction with Crush, or at least cripple the tank with a Heal Reversal or Dispel their guard skill, or he can just straight up cripple the tanks and any other units that he hits with his AoE, which prevents healing and prevents guarding. So if they don't have any Dispel, they might as well not have a tank at this point. So he can also be difficult to counter kill if you draft incorrectly against it. So I've been in scenarios where there's just a Werewolf Wedham, he came in, attacked my tank, I looked at my units and I realized, hey, I actually can't kill this guy in any one hit. And then, you just lose the tempo game after that. And finally, Clock and Chant. I really don't need to say much more about that. Frankly, this hero doesn't really have any cons. Generally, the issues that he has will revolve around drafting or execution. Either you have drafted incorrectly or you've played badly. The closest thing I can come up with to a weakness is that werewolves are weak to holy, so in certain matchup you kind of have to bring gargoyles so he has less self-sustain and less damage, but you can hardly call that a weakness really. So next up we have SP Diehard. So SP Diehard had access to the new troops, which is fairies, that got added in this update, which means he can finally make use of his Terrain Master movement. And with that Terrain Master movement, he actually has the highest mobility out of all the assassins. Basically, without factoring in Breeze, he has a 5+3+2 attack 10 range, which is equal with SP Sigma's dual skill. So other than that, he also has very strong utility in his Oath, which allows him to buff one other female unit such as Cherry, T-Jazz, Lucretia, so that, or even IBC, so that they don't need to carry their strengthen or mass attacks. And having Stun after his 3C is very good utility, especially if the opponent team are lacking Dispel. And even if they have healers that can Dispel, you at least force that healer to move first, which can be a benefit by itself. He is deceptively bulky because of his talent of having 25% damage reduction when within 3 blocks of any female unit. It can be both an enemy's unit or your own unit. And he also heals for 25% each time he performs an action within 3 blocks of said female unit. So because of that damage reduction, he can actually tank like random shit. I've been in a situation where I was standing on a forest and I actually tanked an Epsilon's 3C, which is not something you expect because fairies don't have any defensive stats. So you would think that Diehard's actually kind of squishy, but he lived. So he can tank all sorts of random shit like that. And if you really want to come up with a limitation on this hero, his kill range is slightly lower than things like Werner and a fully buffed Epsilon, but it's still really solid in general. He gets most kills that he needs to. For number 4, we have Werner. Honestly, there's not too much to say about this unit. He simply is the highest kill range out of all the assassins in existence. And recently, I find that tank push players have started to realize that, and they first ban him accordingly. So previously, they would ban things like Pepsi because he buffs all the other assassins. But then they realized that the guy that's actually killing their units is actually Werner. So other than that, stance mind games, I think it's whatever in my opinion, but it's worth a mention. You can do funny things with it. Like baiting them to think you're a defensive stance, but actually you're in an attack stance, and then you just kill the unit. Then he's a little bit of a one trick, which is that he's exceedingly good at the one thing he does, which is assassinating units. And then he lacks sustain overall. He has, I don't even know what that skill is called. Sunshade? Yeah, Sunshade, which you don't usually bring. And then there's his other terrain passive, which lets him heal a bit after he attacks on terrain. But, it's not consistent, so overall he still lacks sustain. He's also kind of dead on turn 1 before he enters into any stance. He can still counter kill things if they are right in front of him, but otherwise, he basically has no threat range on turn 1. And then he gets smashed by AoE, by damage, or by debuffs. So for number 5, we have Autocrato, which is a returning member of my box. And the main thing he does is that he's able to do his bullshit from halfway across the map, which is incredibly annoying. He steals your buff, he swaps your positioning, and he does chip damage via his provoke debuff if you don't have Rosen. So, when you see him on the opponent team, you'll hear him shout this, which basically translates into our buffs now, comrade. And then he just taxes your buff. He takes 1 off everything that he hits. And honestly, you can win games on the spot if you get a nasty tank positioning swap or a crucial buff steal. So other than that, he's borderline unsnipeable because he has fucking 14k HP on his body, and then his troops have 17k HP for whatever reason. Which basically means usually you need at least 2 hits if not more to kill him. And his one weakness I find is that he can't counter kill for shit if there's too much offensive pressure. So if you're looking at like 3 to 4 DPSs coming into your face in a row, you won't be able to manage it because he can't counter kill, and then you just lose the tempo war. Because his role is primarily just harassment. He actually doesn't kill units. He just makes it harder for them to kill your units. But if they can, still do their job, he will lose. So by extension of Autocrato, I want to introduce to you Hilda Auto Rosen. So sometimes this combo can just auto win by reaching the center, and you get 2 other units who help create that winning scenario. So recently I find that I got this draft a lot. Not even intentionally, sometimes I just get Rosen 5th pick. Because I think people kind of just tunnel vision on my DPS options. They want to ban my assassins, or they want to ban my, Ares, displacement, long range units. And then they leave all 3 of these units for me to pick. and then I got like roughly 50% of my wins off of this specific 3-hero combo. So other than that, I think one particular weakness of this combo is that Rosen actually can't single target heal for nuts because her healing multiplier is very low and she has very low int. So if you draft incorrectly and you give too many tank busters or assassins, your lineup can crumble because either your healer dies or your autocrator dies. And then, you can't do damage after that, or you just die one by one after that. So finally, for the last section, very dramatic name, but it basically just means that things that are usually, that used to be first or second pick worthy has had their draft priority been lowered. So the first unit that's on here is Epsilon, because if you have been following my content before this, during the last playoffs, I religiously just first pick Epsilon pretty much all the time if you don't first ban it. And it was possible at that time because I think tanks were still more prevalent during that meta. And then what I'll do is I just first pick Epsilon, and then I'll just pick whatever assassin that comes after that, and then I will just trade until I win. So right now the meta has evolved in a more aggressive direction. So there's more pressure to actually pick up a more long range unit or more aggressive unit, because you can pick him up as a janitor most of the time. You need to pick up someone that actually can zone the opponent, because Epsilon turn 1 he has to buff. He's dead on turn 1, and especially if you're on player 2, you find yourself getting overwhelmed at the start of turn 2. So the second point is kind of similar to the previous one. He needs units to go in front and trade for him in order for him to build his stacks properly, because he needs those stacks in order to score certain kills reliably. However, at the end of the day, he's still, I think, in my opinion, the best janitor in the game at the moment, and sometimes he can just 1v2 their tank and healer, or sometimes even 1v3 in the correct scenario. So finally, we have the second unit that is featured in this section, which is SP Sigma. So SP Sigma was a flavor unit that I've introduced into my box, and I've regularly second picked him behind Epsilon for a while now before this, but he's been kind of outclassed recently. So similarly to Pepsi, he's kind of slow on turn 1, so he needs a turn to click on his ranger's eye to set up his other attack skill, or to duel even. So one of the reasons that he's fallen off is that 1-up cherry has been kind of becoming the norm. So that's one less thing that he can bait for a counter kill. So previously in my box, one of my Sigma's primary role when I picked him is that I can delay the bans on SP Cherry and Kyra, because I know my Sigma can counter kill those units, so I'm less scared of them. So now that 1-up Cherry has started showing up, he can't counter kill that unit anymore, so his utility has been lowered somewhat. So long range Cyborg build has kind of a scuff kill range, I find. In matchups where you're not fighting a tank, you just bring 2 long range attacks. So one thing is that he has a downtime, so even though you can bring his Ranger's Heart, I think that skill is called, which is his Act Again skill, to get his talent back after you attack. But if you don't have that skill, he has a 1-turn downtime in between attacks. And I find that Cyborgs have, they kind of have sus damage. They can miss kills randomly. Especially in this kind of matchup, you'll usually be fighting things like Wetham Werewolves, which you will never kill pretty much. And you will also be fighting Die Hard. I'm not sure if he kills that because I've never actually been in that scenario. But given that it's a cavalry, and depending on how the animation works, he might miss that kill as well. So he comes down to counter killing things that have already done their job. So, that's not very nice. So, but at the end of the day, having said that, his duo is still incredibly reliable at scoring kills if he's not getting run over by aggressive teams. And that is basically it. So this is a pretty long video, as I mentioned. So future episodes of this series, I don't know if I'm gonna call it episodes, probably not, probably just part of a series, And I think future videos will be shorter because either the new units aren't as relevant, so there's less things to talk about them, or I won't need to spend as much time on the high achievers or fallen from grace sections, because that sort of thing doesn't actually change much between 4 weeks usually. So like this time I had 5 units featured in the high achievers and 2 units in the fallen from grace, but usually they stay the same way and I won't need to mention as much. But with that said, we've come to the end of the video, so I hope this was informative if you've watched up to this point. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you later. Peace.